Lucinda. The voices reached her in the murky darkness. Come back, wait. She ignored them, pressing further. Echoes of her name bouncing off the shadowy walls of the announcer, sending licks of heat rippling across her skin. Was that Daniel's voice or Cam's, Ariane or Gabe's? Was it Roland pleading that she come back now, or was that Miles? The calls grew harder to discern until Luce couldn't tell them apart at all, good or evil, enemy or friend. They should have been easier to separate, but nothing was easy anymore. Everything that had once been black and white now blended into grey. Of course, both sides agreed on one thing. Everyone wanted to pull her out of the announcer for her protection, they would claim. No thanks. Not now. Not after they'd wrecked her parents' backyard, made it into another one of their dusty battlefields. She couldn't think about her parents' faces without wanting to turn back. Not like she'd even know how to turn back inside the announcer anyway. Besides, it was too late. Cam had tried to unalive her. Or what he thought was her, and Miles had saved her, but even that was simple. He'd only been able to throw her reflection because he cared about her too much, and Daniel, did he care enough? She couldn't tell. In the end, when the outcast had approached her, Daniel and the others had stared at Luce like she was the one who owed them something. You are our entrance to heaven, the outcast had told her. The price. What had that meant? A couple of weeks ago, she hadn't even known the outcasts existed, and yet they wanted something from her, badly enough to battle Daniel for it. It must have had to do with the curse, the one that kept Luce reincarnated lifetime after lifetime. But what did they think Luce could do? Was the answer buried somewhere? Her stomach lurched as she tumbled senselessly through the cold shadow, deep inside the chasm of the dark announcer. Luce. The voices began to fade and grow dimmer. Soon they were barely whispers, almost like they had given up, until they started to grow louder again, louder and clearer. Luce. No, she clamped her eyes shut to try and block them out. Lucinda, Lucy, Lisa, Lushaska. She was cold, and she was tired, and she didn't want to hear them. For once she wanted to be left alone. Lushaska, Lusashka, Lusashka. Her feet hit something with a thump. Thump. I don't know. Something very, very cold. She was standing on solid ground. She knew she wasn't tumbling anymore, though she couldn't see anything in front of her except for the blanket of blackness. Then she looked down at her Converse sneakers and gulped. They were planted in a blanket of snow that reached midway up her calves, the dank coolness that she was used to, the shadowy tunnel that she'd been travelling through. Out her backyard first time Luz had stepped through an announcer from her shoreline dorm room to Las Vegas, she had been with her friends Shelby and Miles. At the end of the passage, they'd met a barrier, a dark, shadowy curtain between them and the city. Because Miles was the only one who'd read the text on stepping through, he'd started swiping the announcer with a circular motion until the murky black shadow flaked away. Luz hadn't known until that he'd been troubleshooting. This time there was no barrier, maybe because she was travelling alone through an announcer summoned of her own fierce will, but the way out was so easy, almost too easy. The veil of blackness simply parted, a blast of cold tore into her, making her knees lock with the chill. Her ribs stiffened and her eyes stared into a sharp, sudden wind. Where was she? Luz already regretted her panic jump through time. Yes, she needed an escape, and yes, she wanted to trace her past, to save her former self from all the pain, to understand what kind of blood she had with Daniel all those times, to feel it instead of being told about it, to understand and then fix whatever curse had been inflicted on Daniel and her. But not like this. Frozen, alone, and completely unprepared for whenever she was. She could see a snowy street in front of her, a steel grey sky above white buildings. She could hear something rumbling in the distance. But she didn't want to think about what any of it meant. Wait, she whispered to the announcer. The shadow drifted hastily a foot or so beyond her fingertips. She tried to grasp it, but the announcer eluded her, flickering further away. She leaped for it and caught a tiny damp piece of it in between her fingers. But then, in an instant, the announcer shattered into soft black fragments on the snow. They faded, then were gone. Great, she murmured. Now what? In the distance, the narrow road curved left to meet a shadowy intersection. The sidewalks were piled high with shoveled snow, which had been packed against two long banks of white stone buildings. They were striking, unlike anything Luz had ever seen. A few stories tall. With their entire facade carved into rows of brighter white arches and elaborate columns, all the windows were dark. Luz got the sense that the whole city might be dark. The only light came from a single gas street lamp. If there was any moon, it was hidden by a thick blanket of cloud. Again something rumbled in the sky. Thunder. Luz hugged her arms around her chest. She was freezing. Lushaska. I don't actually know if that's the name, I'm just saying it because I can't pronounce it. Sorry. Anyway, a woman's voice, hoarse and raspy, like someone who'd spent her whole life barking orders. But the voice was trembling too. "Luciska, you idiot, where are you?" She sounded closer now. She was talking to Luz. There was something else about that voice, something strange that Luz couldn't quite put into words. When a figure came hobbling around this snowy street corner, Luz stared at the woman trying to place her. She was very short and a little hunched over, maybe in her late 60s. Her bulky clothes seemed too big for her body. Her hair was tucked under a thick black scarf. When she saw Luz, her face scrunched into a complicated grimace. "Where have you been?" Luz looked around. She was the only other person in the street. The old woman was speaking to her. "Right here," she heard herself say, in Russian. She clapped her hand over her mouth. So that was what had seemed so bizarre about the old woman's voice. She was speaking a language Luz had never learned, and yet not only did Luz understand every word, but she could speak it back. "I could. You." I'm not saying the word because I don't want to get in trouble with YouTube. As she rushed towards Luz and threw her arms around her. For such a frail-looking woman, her embrace was strong. The warmth of another body pressing into Luz after so much intense cold made her almost want to cry. She hugged her back. "Grandma," she whispered, her lips close to the woman's ear, somehow knowing that was who the woman was. "Of all the nights I get off work to find you gone," the woman said. "Now you're skipping around in the middle of the street like a lunatic. Did you even go to work today? Where is your sister?" There was a rumbling in the sky again. It sounded like a bad storm moving closer, moving faster. Luz shivered and shook her head. She didn't know. "Aha," the woman said. "Not so carefree now." She squinted at Luz and pushed her away to get a closer look. "My God, what are you wearing?" Luz fidgeted as per her past life's grandma, gaped at her jeans and ran her knobbly fingers over the buttons of Luz's flannel shirt. She grabbed Luz's short tangled ponytail. "Sometimes I think you're as crazy as your father. May he rest in peace." Luz's teeth were chattering. "I didn't know it was going to be so cold." The woman spat on the snow to show her disapproval. She peeled off her overcoat. "Take this before you catch your death." She bundled the coat roughly around Luz, whose fingers were half frozen as she struggled to button it. Then her grandmother untied the scarf from her head and wrapped it around Luz's head. A great boom in the sky startled both of them. Now Luz knew it wasn't thunder. "What is that?" she whispered. The old woman stared at her. "The war," she muttered. "Did you lose your wits with your clothes? Come now, we must go." As they waddled down the snowy street over the rough cobbles and the tram tracks set into them, Luz realized that the city wasn't empty after all. Few cars were parked along the road, but occasionally down the darkened side streets she heard the whinnies of carriage horses waiting for orders, their frosty breaths clotting in the air. Silhouette bodies scampered across rooftops. Down at the alley, a man in a torn overcoat helped their small children through the hatched doors of a basement. At the end of the narrow street, the road opened onto a broad tree-lined avenue with a wide view of the city. cars parked here were military vehicles. They looked old-fashioned, almost absurd, like relics in a war museum. Soft-top jeeps with giant fenders, bone-thin steering wheels, and a Soviet hammer and sickle painted onto the doors. But aside from Luce and her grandmother, there were no people on the street. Everything except for the awful rumbling in the sky was ghostly, eerily quiet. In the distance, she could see a river, and far across it, a great building. Even in the darkness, she could make out its elaborate tired spires and ornate onion-shaped domes, which seemed familiar and mythic at the same time. It took a moment to sink in, and then fear shot through Luce. She was in Moscow, and the city was a war zone. Black smoke rose in the grey sky, marking the pockets of the city that had already been hit. To the left of the vast Kremlin, and just behind it, and again in the distance, to the far right. There was no combat on the street, no sign that enemy soldiers had crossed into the city yet on foot. But the flames licking the charred buildings, the incendiary smell of war everywhere, and the threat of more to come were somehow even worse. This was by far the most messed up thing Luce has ever done in her life, and probably in any of her lives. Parents would kill her if they knew where she was. Daniel might never speak to her again. But then, what if they didn't even have the chance to be furious with her? She could die right here in the war zone. Why had she done this? Because she'd had to. It was hard to unearth that small hint of pride in the midst of her panic, but it must have been there somewhere. She'd stepped through on her own into the distant place and faraway time, into the past that she needed to understand. This was what she'd wanted. She'd been pushed around like a chess piece long enough. But what was she supposed to do now? She picked up her pace and held tight to her grandmother's hand. Strange, this woman had no real sense of what Luce was going through, no real idea of who she even was, and yet the tug of her dry grip was the only thing keeping Luce moving. "Where are we going?" Luce asked her grandmother. Yanked her down another darkened street. The cobblestones tapered off and the road became unpaved and slippery. The snow had soaked through the canvas of Luce's tennis shoes, and her toes were starting to burn with the cold. "To collect your sister Christina," the old woman scowled. "The one who works nights digging army trenches with her bare hands so you can get your beauty rest. Remember her?" Where they stopped, there was no street lamp to light the road. Luce blinked a few times to help her eyes adjust. They were standing in front of what looked like a very long ditch, right in the middle of the city. There must have been 100 people there, all of them bundled up into their ears. Some were down on their knees digging with shovels, some were digging with their hands, some stood as if frozen, watching the sky. A few soldiers carted off heavy loads of earth and rock in splintery wheelbarrows and farm carts to add to the bodies were hidden under thick army-issue wool coats that billowed out around their knees, but beneath their steel hats, their faces were as gaunt as any other civilians. Lucinda understood that they were all working together, the men in the uniform, and the women and children turning the cities into a fortress, doing anything they could down to the very last minute to keep the enemy tanks out. Christina, her grandmother called, the same notes of panic washed love in her voice as when she'd begun looking for Luce. The girl appeared at their side almost instantly. "What took you so long?" Tall and thin, with dark strands of hair escaping from the porcupine hat on her head. Christina was beautiful. Luce had to swallow a lump in her throat. She recognized the girl as family right away.